Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media. While we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum, I remain in the underclass. The real story of Barry Seal and the CIA enterprise provides a clear window into the anatomy of the deep state. The perfect encapsulation of an unfettered shadow government bureaucracy hell-bent on establishing its dominance over all of society. Episode 12, we indict the United States government and declare that drugs were always meant to win the war. The very same time First Lady Nancy Reagan was launching the Just Say No campaign in order to ease the concerned minds of the American public, the very same government was responsible for fueling the epidemic responsible for destroying countless American lives. An incredible book with the title Barry and the Boys, The CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History, written by Daniel Hopsicker, lays out the central thesis that following Barry Seal's lifelong government career in clandestine services leads in a straight line from the killing of a president. Seal's CIA handler, Dave Dixon, was a great good friend of the only man ever charged with conspiracy to murder President Kennedy, Clay Shaw. To the ruin of the inner cities of this country by the cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, an epidemic fueled in no small part by the billions of dollars worth of cocaine which Barry Seal's operation imported. Commenting on the CIA's affair with the Mafia, LBJ's press secretary, Bill Moyers, said, "Once we decide that anything goes, anything can come home to haunt us."
Exactly 3 years ago, I promised you a president who feels your pain and who shares your dreams. I want to talk to you about a fundamental threat to American democracy. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years.
He used to smuggle drugs, then he got caught and he became one of the government's most valuable informants in the war against cocaine. But last night in Louisiana, Barry Seal's enemies caught up with him and killed him. Tonight, 3 men are in custody. NBC's Brian Ross reports that Seal was about to testify for the government once again.
Authorities believe last night's machine gun killing of top drug informant Barry Seal was ordered by drug bosses in Medellin, Colombia, who sent 5 men to Baton Rouge to kill Seal. Seal's son, Barry Jr., one of 5 children, was restrained by police, who said the gunman had waited in ambush for Seal at a Salvation Army shelter, where Seal had been sentenced by a federal judge on a drug charge to do community service. Seal was a tough guy TWA pilot who got caught smuggling cocaine and became one of the most important and daring undercover operatives, infiltrating the top Colombian drug operations. In a recent interview, Seal said he knew he was risking his life.
The old saying, if you can't stand the heat, don't work in the kitchen. I can take the pressure.
It was Seal who posed as a smuggler and flew into Nicaragua and took these pictures showing Colombian drug dealers and Sandinista officials loading cocaine on his plane. Seal busted up the Colombian connection in the Caribbean country of Turks and Caicos, setting up a payoff meeting on videotape that led to the arrest and conviction of the country's prime minister. And Seal was scheduled to be the key witness against this man, Jorge Ochoa, the top Colombian drug boss, now in jail in Spain, about to be extradited to the United States. Authorities say the Ochoa drug organization was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota last year, the assassination of Colombia's Attorney General, and now the murder in Louisiana of the man who was perhaps the most important undercover drug informant ever. Brian Ross, NBC News.
The real Barry Seal was much more than a commercial airline pilot recruited by the CIA after being caught smuggling Cuban cigars to make a little extra money on the side. That could not have been farther from the truth, yet served as a crucial moment depicted most recently in the Hollywood movie American Made, starring Tom Cruise as our leading man. Beyond the generous casting decision, the film almost seemed to purposely fumble the most important revelations in the life story of a man who should have implicated the highest levels of our federal government as being directly involved in the planning and execution of some of the most consequential illegal covert operations in all of American history. Adler Berryman Barry Seal was born July 16, 1939 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Allegedly, his father, who was a candy wholesaler, had been known as a member of the local chapter of the KKK. And as the story goes, during his childhood in the early 1950s, he would work different jobs around the old airport in exchange for flight time with the local instructor. According to Time.com, Seal obtained his student pilot license at 15 and became fully licensed at 16. His instructor was so impressed by his natural talent that he allowed him to fly solo after only 8 hours of training. In 1957, before Barry Seal would even graduate high school, he had earned his private pilot wings, and according to his flight instructor Ed Dufford, he was a uniquely talented aviator from the start, even going so far as to say, "That boy was first cousin to a bird." Ed Dufford would later go on to become the flight instructor for none other than Mohammed Atta, Egyptian hijacker and supposed ringleader of the September 11, 2001 attacks, when he flew American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. As a high schooler, Barry was known for his skywriting gig when he owned a small charter business towing advertising banners at 17 years old. He had become known for recreationally flying helicopters all around the area, and there were even reports of Barry performing dangerously low flybys, causing cancellations or stoppages in play at the LSU football and baseball games. In 1958, he borrowed a plane from a local university chemistry professor, promptly crashing it into a field. Newspapers would report engine trouble as the cause, but Dufford said that Barry was showing off and had cut the engine mid-flight in an effort to impress his friends. The engine malfunctioned and wouldn't restart, so he successfully floated the aircraft down and gently crash-landed it into a field. His friends apparently exited the aircraft once they crash-landed, but Barry took back off with the plane, and upon briefly ascending to about 150 feet, the engine seized again, although he had not gained enough altitude to perform the float aerial maneuver that saved them just moments before. This time, he would crash land much harder into a soybean field, where the plane was absolutely totaled, and Barry sustained significant injuries, causing him to have his jaw wired shut for months. His father's reaction upon hearing the news was to sue the professor for over $100,000, claiming that Barry was a minor and should never have had access to the plane in the first place. Plus, he demanded compensation for the subsequent medical costs. Barry himself would also up the ante on this claim, stating that he had suffered a loss of reputation as an aviator, as well as unfavorable publicity in his community of aviators. The Seal family attorney would not go through with the lawsuit due to his doubts in the witness testimony that included multiple different claims, such as blaming the engine of the plane for the crash and saying that someone had filled the aircraft with non-aviation fuel the day before, which led directly to the engine failure. In 1955, when he was only 16 years old, Barry joined the Civil Air Patrol in Baton Rouge, where he would inevitably take part in a CAP joint training mission with the New Orleans unit that was controlled and operated by David Ferrie. David Ferrie was an American pilot with strong affiliations to military intelligence and organized crime, who was alleged by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison to have been involved in a conspiracy to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. This is where Barry Seal would meet another young 15-year-old boy taking part in the very same joint exercise while in David Ferry's Civil Air Patrol unit, whose name was Lee Harvey Oswald. Barry was obviously not your average high schooler. According to friend and classmate of Seal's, John Odom, one Friday evening while we were in high school, I got a call from Barry, Odom began, asking if I'd like to fly with him in the morning over to Lacombe, a little town on the North Shore across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans. We left about 5:30 a.m. and flew over to the little airport there. And when we got off the plane, there was a guy on the tarmac dressed all in black. Black military fatigues, black boots, a black beret. He was sitting in a director's chair, drilling a bunch of Civil Air Patrol cadets, all carrying the old M1 rifles, standing in formation in front of him. His name was David Ferry. He was a captain in the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol, and he had fake eyebrows, real weird, with one eyebrow turned up at a 45-degree angle. I laughed when I saw him, and Barry, he didn't like that. He told me to stay by the plane or he wouldn't let me fly back with him to Baton Rouge. Odom watched them confer, he said, and saw Ferry point to the 50 or so wooden crates staged next to the tarmac. On the way back to Baton Rouge, Barry Seal told him that he was working for Ferry, who he said was CIA. Ferry's CIA link was confirmed by Victor Marchetti, former deputy assistant to Richard Helms, who testified that Helms disclosed in executive discussions during the Garrison investigation that Ferry had in fact been employed by the CIA. Seal said he was making $400 a week flying runs of crates of weapons and ordnance for Ferry, said Odom. He asked me, "How'd you like to make that kind of money?" Something happened to Barry Seal during his time with David Ferry's Civil Air Patrol unit. It was as if he had been recruited into some kind of exclusive, covert inner circle. At this point, I began to see flashbacks of Tim McVeigh, with the sort of sheep-dipped cover story that seemed to take place shortly after his time with the Louisiana Cap. We're meant to believe not much happened, glossing over the rest of his high school years, until he turned 18 and could finally enlist in the Louisiana Army National Guard. He would serve for 6 years, with only 6 months of active duty, starting July 1962. After being assigned to the 20th Special Forces Group and graduating from the U.S. Army Airborne School Selection and Training Program, the story goes Mr. Seal, Special Forces ace pilot, would be assigned to the 245th Engineer Battalion, where his unique skills would be put to use sitting at a desk as a radio telephone operator. After some digging, it became clear to me that this was not at all the case. And according to an article found at Spartacus Educational, Tosh Plumley claims that Barry Seal began working for the Central Intelligence Agency in the mid-1950s. Barry Seal was involved with military intelligence in the early days. Military intelligence was the real game, with the CIA just acting as logistical people. Barry was a peripheral player back then, but he was a CIA contract pilot all the way back to 1956 or 1957. In 1958, Seal began ferrying weapons to Fidel Castro fighting against the Fulgencio Batista regime in Cuba. At the time, a section of the CIA was supporting the overthrow of Batista. However, the policy changed soon after Castro gained power, and Seal is said to have taken part in air attacks on the new government. The following year, Barry Seal became a CIA pilot in Guatemala. It is also believed that Seal was involved in training Cuban exiles on No Name Key in Florida and on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. He also ran a couple of companies based in Baton Rouge, Seal Sky Service and Aerial Advertising Associates, and had an office in the International Trade Center run by Clay Shaw. Gary Hemming claims that Barry Seal was a member of Operation 40 in the early 1960s. Hemming told author Daniel Hopsicker, "Yeah, Barry was Op 40. He flew in killer teams inside the island of Cuba before the invasion to take out Fidel." In December 1962, Seal joined the 21st Special Forces Group and attended the Fort Benning Jump School. In May 1963, he was assigned to Company D Special Operations Detachment of the 20th Special Forces Group Airborne. Seal also seems to have been involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. According to his wife, Deborah, Barry Seal flew a getaway plane out of Dallas after JFK was killed. In 1964, Seal joined the 245th Engineer Battalion based in St. Louis. He left in 1966. Soon afterwards, he went to work for Howard Hughes in the TWA Corporation. According to his biographer, Seal becomes first the youngest 707 captain, and then later the youngest captain of a 747. Tosh Plumley claims that Barry Seal also worked for Ted Shackley and the CIA. Barry Seal did a lot of damn good stuff in the late 60s. In 67 and 68, he was with Air America in South Vietnam and Laos, during search and destroy and special ops with Ted Shackley's boys. He'd been recruited for special ops because of the Cuban thing. It doesn't seem all that likely that Barry was actually answering phones behind a desk during all of this. But the official line is that he was just a phenomenal pilot who answered phones in the military and then joined TWA as a flight engineer in 1964. He would be promoted very quickly to first officer and then captain, becoming one of the youngest Boeing 707 and 747 command pilots in the TWA fleet. Now we've officially made it to the starting point of the Hollywood movie, American Made, which chose to display a manipulative origin story as to how the CIA initially took notice of Barry Seal. In the fabricated version meant for the big screen, they would portray Barry as a uniquely skilled aviator, growing bored with his mundane lifestyle as a commercial pilot, and in an attempt to make a little extra cash on the side and spicing up his life a bit, he decides to smuggle in some Cuban cigars, drawing the attention of the authorities. While sitting in an airport bar, he would be approached by a CIA handler with an offer he couldn't refuse. However, his reaction in the film is one of excitement, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for, a shot at the big time. A plausible enough starting point to a government-funded drug smuggling career, but this plotline almost seemed designed to miss the point. On July 1st, 1972, Barry would be publicly arrested for the first time along with 7 others who were employed by TWA for attempting to smuggle 14,000 pounds of explosives out of the United States to Cuba through anti-Castro forces in Mexico. A DC-4 was seized at the Shreveport Regional Airport, loaded with almost 7 tons of plastic C4 explosives, 7,000 feet of explosive primer cord, and 2,600 electric blasting caps. Not exactly a box of Cubans. Spartacus article previously mentioned would go on to claim that the DC-4 was owned by James Boy, a known associate of the CIA. Boy's aircraft were later used to fly Oliver North's mercenaries in and out of Honduras. The man who organized the entrapment of Seal and his friends was Cesario Diosdado, an official with the United States Customs. It took the authorities over 2 years to bring Barry Seal to trial. When the trial finally got underway in June 1974, government prosecutors promptly introduced into evidence an automatic weapon that had nothing at all to do with the charges against the defendants. A mistrial was declared, and Seal and his fellow defendants were released. According to Pete Bruton, as soon as Seal was freed, he began working full-time for the CIA, traveling back and forth from the United States to Latin America. Seal was now sheep-dipped, into the Drug Enforcement Administration as an agent for the Special Operations Group. Seal worked under Lucien Conein, who ran secret missions for the DEA. Eagle Crow, who was employed by Richard Nixon as liaison to the FBI and the DEA, later admitted that he placed Cronin in the Office of Narcotics in the White House. Berry was fired by TWA shortly after the arrest in 1972, and after the case was dismissed in 1974, one of the reasons given was that it would threaten national security interests if they proceeded with the trial. Multiple reports claimed that some of the others who had been arrested in the plot to smuggle the explosives along with Seal had also been linked to running guns, as well as having connections to the Gambino crime family. The fact that Berry basically got away with this raised a lot of suspicion within the Justice Department, almost certainly implicating him as a government asset. By all accounts, including his wife Debbie, he started trafficking small amounts of marijuana in 1975 between the U.S. and Central and South America. And by 1978, he made a decision to start trafficking cocaine, claiming that it was easier to get past customs, as well as being much more profitable. On December 10, 1979, Berry was arrested in Honduras, where authorities confiscated $25 million worth of cocaine. He was reported to have 40 kilos and spent the next 9 months in prison, where he would make crucial contacts before being released with no charge. While he was in prison, he attempted to bribe the Guatemalan government to release him, but they held an election before granting his freedom, leaving him to bribe an entire new Guatemalan government after the election process played out. He was released by September 1980, and after meeting Emil Camp and Ellis McKenzie in the Guatemalan prison, who would become two of his closest associates, in some weird twist of fate, he met and befriended a man by the name of William Roger Reeves. James DiEugenio explains in an article at Consortium News, Roger Reeves was a major cocaine smuggler who was working with the Medellin cartel when he first met Seal on a plane leaving Honduras after he was released. Reeves invited Seal to his home in California, became very impressed with his flying skills. He offered to subcontract out some of his work for the cartel, which at that time consisted of the Ochoa brothers, Carlos Lehder, and Pablo Escobar. Investigative journalist Daniel Rennie claims that in 1981, the pilot made his first flight for the Ochoa brothers, a founding family of the cartel. Their operation proved so successful that Seal was at one time considered the biggest drug smuggler in Louisiana state. According to the Washington Post, Seal earned as much as $1.5 million per flight, and by the end, he had accumulated up to $100 million. Seal used his knowledge of aviation to aid in his life of crime, and once he flew into U.S. airspace, Seal would drop his plane to 500 feet and slow to 120 knots to mimic a helicopter on the radar screen of anyone who was watching, as the small aircraft frequently flew between oil rigs and the coast. Within U.S. airspace, Seal would have people on the ground monitor for any signs his planes were being tailed. If they were, the mission was aborted. If not, they would continue on to drop sites over the Louisiana Bayou, where duffel bags full of cocaine were tossed into the swamp. Helicopters would pick up the contraband and transport it to offloading sites, and then on to Ochoa distributors in Miami by car or truck. Del Hahn, author of the book Smuggler's End, The Life and Death of Berry Seal, wrote that by 1982, Seal was using over a dozen aircraft in his smuggling operation. The number of planes and the frequency of flights soon attracted the attention of Louisiana State Police and federal investigators. To avoid this unwanted attention, Seal moved his aircraft to Mena Intermountain Regional Airport in Mena, Arkansas, where he did maintenance and modifications to improve the plane's carrying capacity and avionics. It was reported that Berry was working directly for the CIA-protected Bolivian drug trafficker Sonia Atala, who was known as the most powerful drug lord in Bolivia at the time, and also being considered directly responsible for the 1980 Bolivian coup d'etat known as the Cocaine Coup. One of my favorite resources for this subject, author Daniel Hopsicker, would write about Seal obtaining two brand new multi-million-dollar Beechcraft King Air 200s that were purchased by a Phoenix-based corporation that acted as a front for John Singlaub, a known CIA officer. This company also owned Southern Air, a CIA proprietary connected to William Casey, Felix Rodriguez, and George H.W. Bush. James DiEugenio in the Consortium News article would point to the overt government protection Berry had grown accustomed to during this time, leaning even more into this kind of fabled immunity, claiming that somehow Steele managed to acquire protection for his operation. As a Senate investigation led by Senator John Kerry noted in 1989, Steele's associates at the Mena airport were targets of grand jury probes into narcotics trafficking. But even though there was evidence sufficient for an indictment on money laundering charges, and despite the willingness of state and federal officials to proceed, the cases were dropped. Kerry's investigation concluded that the apparent reason might have revealed national security information. That usually means CIA involvement. Another indication of such involvement is the uncovering of a customs official's report where he explains that a drug inquiry into a pilot had to be canceled because he works for Seal and cannot be touched because Seal works for the CIA. FBI documents released to the public unequivocally proved that a joint investigation by the IRS, FBI, and the Arkansas State Police revealed that Berry Seal had used the Mena airport for smuggling activity from late 1980 until March 1984. In April 1981, a DEA informant introduced Seal to an undercover DEA agent. Months later, after arranging several contacts, there was a deal made to have Berry smuggle over 200,000 Quaaludes into the U.S. as a part of a major undercover DEA operation called Operation Screamer. Over 80 pilots would eventually be indicted in the operation, and Berry would ultimately be indicted on multiple charges, including 2 counts of conspiracy to distribute methaqualone, along with multiple counts of possession and distribution of meperidine, methaqualone, and phenobarbital. All reports show that by his own admission, he had by then flown more than 100 flights with 600 to 1,200 pounds of cocaine each, equating to between $3 billion and $5 billion worth of drugs into the U.S. After he was indicted, Berry was facing well over 10 years in prison, and the first thing he tried to do is make a deal with the DEA, offering to turn informant in return for a suspended sentence. Both the Florida and Baton Rouge task force rejected his offer, leaving him desperate enough to reportedly hop onto his Lear jet and fly to Washington, D.C. on March 24, 1983, only to show up at the door of former CIA director and current Vice President George H.W. Bush's Drug Enforcement Task Force. He would arrange a meeting with 2 members of the Vice President's staff, and from there, he would be referred to the DEA office in Miami, where he was assigned 2 agents to debrief and evaluate him as a potential informant. The agents were reportedly impressed by Berry's connections, specifically with the Ochoa family, and within 4 days he would sign an agreement to serve as an official DEA informant. In the book Smuggler's End, The Life and Death of Berry Seal, the author claims that Seal was able to arrange a meeting with his cartel contacts in Miami using the name Ellis McKenzie, which was apparently the real name of one of his associates who had previously dealt with the cartel on his behalf. The Florida DEA task force needed a successful sting operation in order to obtain indictments on the Ochoas and other cartel members in the U.S. 2 weeks after he became an informant for the special program set up by the Vice President's office, he would fly to the Ochoa family ranch in Colombia to meet with Jorge, Fabio, Juan Ochoa, and Pablo Escobar. They only knew him as El Gordo, the Fat One, during their dealings with Berry. And in this meeting, he realized that things were not going well for the cartel during this time. Having recently lost an estimated amount of $1 billion in total assets due to the harsh crackdowns facilitated by new members of the Colombian government. They had originally negotiated a deal promising 3,000 kilos, but they were forced to renegotiate and could only arrange for the shipment of half the original amount. Berry claimed that this was the meeting where he acquired the intelligence so desired by the top American officials in order to provide a pretext for war with the Sandinista-controlled Nicaraguan government, claiming that the Sandinistas had made a deal to smuggle drugs to the U.S. through the Medellin cartel. This was the intelligence that Oliver North and other key members in the Reagan administration needed in order to justify financial and military support for the counter-revolutionary Contra militia, which they had already been providing through illegal covert weapons sales to Iran. The 1989 book Kings of Cocaine claims that the first flight would not go as planned. When they finally arranged for the first shipment, the plane would crash on takeoff at a Colombian airfield. They said it was overloaded, so the cartel provided a new plane that didn't have the required weight capacity for a straight-through flight to the U.S., forcing Berry to make a stop at an airfield in Nicaragua to refuel. After he took back off, he was flying without his lights, attempting to avoid detection while passing over the capital city. And that's when Nicaraguan military units fired upon the plane, forcing an emergency landing at the Sandino International Airport. An aide to the Nicaraguan Minister of the Interior that has been suggested to be somehow affiliated with the CIA arranged for the release of Seal and his co-pilot after the shipment was seized by the military. While Berry was in Managua, he's reported to have met with Pablo Escobar, who was in the middle of setting up another production lab for one of the cocaine operations. Pablo told Berry he should go back to the U.S. and get a bigger plane before they went through with this first shipment. Berry obliged, acquiring a large military transport aircraft called a C-123K, fully outfitted by CIA technicians with hidden cameras installed all over the plane. By June 25th, the deal would finally go as planned, and while Nicaraguan soldiers loaded up the plane with cocaine, the CIA cameras would successfully capture the famous photographs of Berry Seal, Pablo Escobar, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, and Federico Vaughn, the very same CIA-connected aide to the Nicaraguan Minister of the Interior mentioned earlier. After landing at the Homestead Air Force Base in Miami-Dade County, Florida, home to the headquarters of Special Operations Command South, the cocaine was reportedly offloaded into a Winnebago camper, and Seal delivered it to his Colombian contact in Miami. The DEA were ultimately attempting to lure certain leadership in the cartel into easier jurisdictions to perform arrests and extractions. So they strung Berry along as an informant, sending him one last time to Nicaragua with money for Pablo to bribe the government for landing rights. Although the operation would be publicly exposed just before Berry made his last trip, the mainstream publications wouldn't publish anything until July 17th, when the Washington Times printed a front-page article on the covert operation in Nicaragua, putting an end to Seal's cover working with the cartel. PBS claimed that the story was leaked by Oliver North to prove that the Nicaraguan government was involved in the drug trade. North remains a controversial figure for his role in the Iran-Contra affair. He was convicted of his role in that plot to sell weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to support rebels in Nicaragua based on the Boland Amendment, but the convictions were vacated in 1991. As a result of his undercover work with the DEA, Berry would have his 10-year sentence reduced to 6 months probation, providing enough evidence leading to at least 17 criminal convictions. Daniel Hopsicker claimed that Seal told investigators that between March 1984 and August 1985, he made $250,000 smuggling up to 15,000 kilos of cocaine while working for the DEA, and another 575,000 when the DEA let him keep the money from one shipment. Even after his work as an informant against the cartel, He apparently played a key role in a few other undercover operations, including one that led to the apparent arrest and conviction of the Prime Minister of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Seal's legal problems just wouldn't go away despite his role as an informant. Although they had been significantly reduced, he was still contending with a federal grand jury investigation in Baton Rouge, and in an effort to deflect from the bad press, he went on the offensive, contacting a local television station, WBRZ. The judge in Louisiana did not go along with the usual game of simply suspending his charges after he pled guilty like the other legal cases he had gotten out of. And when the Attorney General did not choose to intervene on his behalf, he wound up receiving a very unusual sentence, one that would be at the center of much controversy after his death. The judge sentenced Berry to 6 months of community service, ordering him to report every night between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. to a Salvation Army halfway house, restricting him from leaving the state, as well as placing conditions on his probation that prohibited him from hiring armed security or carrying a firearm. Seal's attorney, Louis Oglesby, told the judge that his ruling amounted to a death sentence for his client, and Berry told his friends that the judge made me a clay pigeon. Spartacus Educational claims that Berry Seal was asked by his close friend Rene Martin if he feared being killed by the Ochoa family. Berry Seal replied that he was not afraid of the Colombians because he had not implicated senior members of the organization. He said he was more worried about his contacts within the U.S. government. February 19th, 1986. Berry pulled into the parking lot of the Salvation Army, where at least 3 men had been waiting in a small car parked off to the side behind the center's donation drop boxes. 2 men got out of the car with fully suppressed MAC-10 submachine guns and opened fire, hitting him 6 times and killing him instantly. 6 Colombians would quickly be arrested for the murder. A friend by the name of Russ Aiken witnessed the assassination and said, "I saw Berry get killed from the window of the Belmont Hotel coffee shop. The killers were both out of the car, one on either side, but I only saw one shoot, as Berry saw it coming and just put his head down on the steering column." After his death, Berry Seal's attorney Louis Oglesby, along with Berry's wife Debbie, never agreed with the official version of events surrounding his murder. The great Daniel Hopsicker would later write in his book Berry and the Boys, Louis Oglesby is today a prominent and very well-connected Louisiana lawyer. At the time, his name was daily on the front page of the state's newspapers, defending his longtime client and associate, Governor Edwin Edwards. Oglesby had told us about a confrontation he had with Berry over the fact that Seal was keeping him in the dark about matters Oglesby considered crucial to defending him. Berry pushed the phone across the desk to me and said, "You want to know what's going on here? Dial this number. Tell him you're me," Oglesby related. When I did what he requested, a female voice answered the phone saying, "Vice President Bush's office, may I help you?" I said, "This is Berry Seal." She asked me to wait while she transferred the call, which was immediately picked up by a man who identified himself as Admiral somebody or other, who said to me, "Berry, where you been?" That's when I told him that I wasn't Berry Seal. I was his lawyer, said Oglesby. Immediately he slammed down the phone. "So why was Berry Seal murdered?" we asked Sharpstein. Oglesby said, "He had been with Seal when the IRS came and seized all his property. The IRS man said, 'You owe us $30 million for the money you made in drug dealing.' 'Hey, I work for you,' was Seal's reply. 'We work for the same people.' 'You don't work for us,' the IRS agent stated. 'We're the IRS.' Oglesby was with Seal when he retired to a back room. He watched as Seal placed a call to George Bush. He heard Barry Seal tell Bush, "If you don't get these IRS assholes off my back, I'm going to blow the whistle on that Contra scheme." Sharpstein spoke solemnly, aware of the gravity of his words. "That's why he's dead," is what Oglesby said. 1 week after the phone conversation between Barry Seal and George Bush, Seal was sentenced to a halfway house. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Barry Seal, "You mean that agent that went bad?" Gordon Novel had casually inquired when we'd posed the question of his associations with Seal. "An agent that goes bad, as we understand intelligence industry trade jargon, is one who contemplates talking." "Seal was gunned down, supposedly by those Colombians," says Sharpstein. "But they were fed information by the assholes in our government who wanted him dead." The assassination of Barry Seal was very likely even not the first attempt on Seal's life by North. We were told by CIA electronics expert Red Hall, on the ground in Nicaragua with Seal on the Sandinista drug sting. "The only thing I knew was the CIA had a lot to do with it," Barry's murder. "The killers were being directed by Oliver North at the time. It was the same thing Oliver North pulled on us down in Nicaragua. Then I didn't know yet that Oliver North had it for Barry Seal, because he was working with Oliver at that particular point. We were undercover, and we were still down there when Oliver blew the whistle on us." Chip Tatum, another covert operative who had known Seal and shared confidences with him, listened with amusement the first time we breathlessly relayed what we'd discovered: that Oliver North is guilty in the assassination of Barry Seal. "No shit, Sherlock," he replied, laughing. "It ain't exactly the secret of the century, I can tell you." Richard Sharpstein had been the defense attorney for one of Seal's assassins, Miguel Velez, and he said, "All 3 Colombians who went on trial always said they were being directed after they got into this country on what to do and where to go by an anonymous gringo, a U.S. military officer, who they very quickly figured out was Oliver North." According to friends, there was another reason George Bush Sr. might have wanted Barry dead. They claimed that Seal had a copy of a videotape of a 1985 DEA cocaine sting, which had netted his 2 sons, George W. and Jeb, for picking up kilos of cocaine at a Florida airport. Barry Seal was a sheep-dipped undercover Special Forces operative from the time he was 16 years old in David Ferry's Civil Air Patrol unit with Lee Harvey Oswald. While he was supposed to be answering phones in the military, he was running guns, flying low and slow into Vietnam, refueling, and then making a pit stop over in Laos to help the CIA propped up opium trade called the Golden Triangle by picking up bales of heroin and smuggling them back to the U.S., all for the Central Intelligence Agency. Barry Seal is only the product of this bureaucratic nightmare we call the United States government, and he sure as hell had a prior relationship with intelligence well before his days moonlighting as a commercial pilot for the TWA. We'll conclude with a brief story told by his widow, Debbie Seal, who said that while she was defending herself from the IRS, she discovered a frequently called phone number in Barry's records. When she dialed it, she discovered it belonged to the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was told to never call it again. Later that day, the DIA phoned her back. They said, "Debbie, you're young. You have a whole life ahead of you. And you have your kids to think about. Don't call anyone in Washington again."